Today's scripture comes from Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. He had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her wife, as her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that he had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to shore. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. The grass withers and the flowers fade.
Well, good morning. My name is Gene, and I'm one of the pastors here at Exilic, and I want to welcome you to our Sunday morning worship. If your favorite drink is chocolate milk, please don't leave the church. We meant no offense. You are more than welcome here. But if you're new, or if you haven't been with us the past few weeks, we're going through a sermon series on abuse. Now, I know that this is a very heavy and difficult topic and triggering for many, but it's one that it's just too important for us to not talk about. And this sermon series is by no means meant to be comprehensive or exhaustive. In the past two sermons, for example, we heard a lot about sexual abuse because that topic has been center stage in public consciousness because of the hashtag #MeToo movement and other high-profile cases. But there are so many other forms of abuse that are just as important for us to talk about. Domestic abuse and child abuse, especially in our Asian context, they're just as prevalent, if not more, than sexual abuse. Emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual abuse are all too familiar, not just to those outside of the church, but very much to those within the church. This sermon series is meant to communicate that this is a topic that we're not going to address just once and then put in a drawer and not talk about anymore. And even though this is the final sermon in the series, this is something that we will continue to address going forward. Many of you have already reached out to us after the first two sermons, but if there are others here who would like to talk or to learn more, or to ask questions, or to receive prayer, please don't hesitate to reach out. And there are also two books that I'd like to recommend, and they've really helped me this past year understand the topic a lot better. The first is called Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church, and that's written by Diane Langberg, who Pastor Aaron quoted a lot the past two sermons. And the second book is called Is It Abuse by Darby Strickland. If you or someone you know is being abused, this second book Is it abuse? It's definitely one that I would recommend that you read and give out. Because church, specifically, should be the safest place for all of God's people. Instead, it's too often been a place where abuse flourishes, where victims are silenced and shamed. Abusers are enabled and protected. How can we reverse this trend? How can victims of abuse find grace and help in the church? How can they be heard, supported, healed, and protected? And how can the church stop overlooking or enabling abuse within its walls? In order to answer these questions, we need to know and see how God views abuse and how he loves his sheep and hates all who would threaten or hurt them. So in our passage today, we have three characters, and they're entangled in this web of oppression. You might have missed this story in the past, so let me summarize it for us real quick before we take a closer look. Abram, later to be called Abraham, has been called by God in Genesis 12 to leave his home and go to the land that God has promised him, the land of Canaan. And he's 75 years old when this happens. His wife Sarai is 10 years younger. They leave their home. They obey God. And then God promises Abram land and offspring. But 10 years go by. They're not getting any younger. And what happens? Still no child. So in our passage today, Sarai takes matters into her own hands. She forces her slave Hagar to bear a child for them. And then Hagar conceives. And when she does, things get worse. The text says that she has contempt for Sarai. In the Hebrew, it means she curses Sarai. There's bitterness and hurt here, understandably so. But Sarai can't have it. She goes to Abram and blames him. Abram says, "What do you want with me? She's your servant. She's in your power. You do what you want with her." It says then that Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, forcing her to run away into the wilderness. And it's there where God comes to Hagar and meets with her. We have three characters here: Sarai, her husband Abram, and her personal servant Hagar. And I want to take a look at each of these three characters to better understand the dynamics of abuse and how God responds to abuse. We have Sarai, the abuser. We have Abram, the enabler. And finally, we have Hagar, the victim. First, let's look at the abuser in this story, Sarai. Sarai is the wife of Abram, an important and wealthy man by this time. She's also his half-sister. Kind of weird, but more accepted back then, I suppose. One of the things we know about Sarai, and that stands out, it is her beauty, her physical beauty. When we first meet her in Genesis 12, she's already 65 years old, but still Abram is terrified that people will kill him because she's so beautiful just to take her. 65. Wow. So what does he do? He tells everyone, "Oh, no, that's not my wife, that's my sister." And you think Abram's being paranoid, but sure enough, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, notices Sarai and takes her as his wife. Wow. And then God has to intervene. God afflicts the house of Pharaoh with diseases, and finally Pharaoh learns why. And he gives her back to Abram, and he sends them away. What kind of person is Sarai? She has wealth. She has prestige. She has surpassing beauty. But she can't get over the fact that she doesn't have one thing, a child. After 10 years of trying and waiting, she finally decides to take matters into her own hands. She gives her servant Hagar to Abram as a surrogate. Hagar meant nothing to Sarai. Just a person to be used to get what she wants. And then she treats Hagar cruelly and abusively. What is at the heart of abuse? Darby Strickland, in the book I mentioned earlier, Is It Abuse? She writes, abusers feel entitlement. I demand. I am owed. I have the right to insist. What I want matters most. Oppressors see only one path, the path of fulfilling their desires. They will use whatever means are necessary to get what they want. For Sarai, what she is entitled to is more important than how others are treated. No one else, nothing else matters to her except getting what she wants, what she does not have. Rather than wait on God, she will do whatever is necessary to have a child. And it's also true that abusers, they see themselves as victims. And this is Sarah's mindset. Verse 2 says, she says to her husband that the Lord prevented me from bearing children. Do you see that language? The Lord prevented me from bearing children. He's against me. And then in verse 5, we see that she has a totally warped view of reality. She sees herself as the victim again. And it's crazy because Hagar is her slave. Sarai forces Hagar to sleep with Abram and bear Abram's child, but yet somehow she can still see herself as the victim and Hagar as the oppressor. She has contempt on me, Abram. She's looking down on me because she has the child. She says in verse 5, may the wrong done to me be on you. You see, in Sarai's mind, she's the victim. She's been wronged. Everybody else is at fault. Everybody is against her. Darby Strickland says, oppressors feel that their efforts to get what they want are so justified that they are blind or indifferent to the effects that their demands have on others. Sarai does three things in this passage that are textbook for what toxic, entitled, and abusive people do. First, she deflects all blame. Second, she admits no wrongdoing. And third, she rationalizes punishing behaviors as an appropriate response. It's God's fault. It's Hagar's fault. It's Abram's fault. Everybody is against her. And she becomes violent and cruel, yet in her mind, this is an entirely appropriate response to what Hagar has done to her. I think it's important for us to see this pattern in Sarai so that we can also identify such tendencies in the people around us as well as in our own hearts. Do we know of such people who may be hurting others? Do we see similar inclinations in our own thoughts and behaviors? And we see in Sarai's case that the behavior becomes progressively more severe. In Genesis 21, a couple of chapters later, she finally has a child, Isaac. And this is 15 years after our passage. She still abuses Hagar. She demands that Abram cast her out, her and her child, Ishmael. Send her and her child out into the wilderness to die. Get rid of them. Unless such behavior is identified and challenged, the abuser will become more and more abusive, never less. Sarai is an abusive person, and she should have been called out and stopped. Why did this continue for so long and get so out of control? Because Abram, the one who should have defended Hagar and obeyed the will of God, he did nothing. He let himself be led by her. He agreed to sleep with Hagar, to shortcut the plan of God, and he turned a blind eye to Sarai's cruelty and violence toward Hagar. And in Genesis 21, he listens to his wife again. He sends Hagar and his own son out into the wilderness with just some bread and water. Sustained abuse, it almost always has people who knew to some extent. They knew but did nothing. And in cases like we saw the last 2 Sundays with David and Amnon, you have people actively enabling and protecting the abusers. In our passage, I don't think Abram was cruel and vindictive like his wife. I don't think he liked the idea of Hagar being abused. And in Genesis 21, we see that he hates having to cast Hagar and Ishmael out. But he says and does nothing when he was the only one who could say or do something. Why? Why didn't Abram say or do anything? I think part of it was that he saw the goal initially as good. God promised us a child. It's not happening. We're old. Maybe this is how he wants us to conceive. So he could have justified the abusive act of forcing a slave to bear a child by believing it to be God's will. He refused to speak against abuse. He even participated in it because he believed in a greater goal. This is what happens too many times in abusive systems. Spiritual abuse, it often happens when with a charismatic leader who is a great communicator, but he's also domineering, bullying, and deceptive, much like Sarai in this passage. Others in the system, they refuse to challenge the abuser because of all the good that they believe is happening. Look at how much the church is growing. Look at how many YouTube views our services have. Look at how many people are being saved. Look at all the fruit. So people don't speak up even when they see abuse happening because they don't want to hurt the institution. They don't want to hurt the ministry. They don't want to hurt God's success. And what happens is the abuser in a position of power goes unchecked and often is enabled and protected to continue in abusive behavior. This cannot be our church. It cannot. We cannot allow ourselves to ever become a system that fosters, covers up, or ignores abuse within our family. We can never try to protect the institution at the expense of the people, especially the most vulnerable among us. And this is something that we as spiritual leaders have to take seriously. It has to start at the very top. We cannot ever become like Sarai and Abram. Our ruling elder candidates are currently being examined. They have a big oral exam today, actually, tonight after service. And during our training, we devoted a lot of time talking about abuse in the church. And I'm so thankful that we're going to have ruling elders, because shared leadership, while it never guarantees that abuse won't happen, it definitely adds checks and balances that help. And one of the things we talked about is that we cannot be a session that just looks out for one another. Our priority, our primary responsibility and obligation is to shepherd the flock. So God forbid, if any accusation of any sort of abuse is brought to the staff or session, our responsibility is not to protect the leader, but to hear, support, and love the sheep. And we have to be deliberate, intentional about this, because our natural tendency is to do the opposite. I shared this with Pastor Aaron and the elder candidates. This is 100% hypothetical, but I've known Pastor Aaron since high school. He's more than a friend. He's more than a best friend. He's a brother to me. And if there is ever an accusation brought against him of abuse, my natural tendency is going to be to give him the benefit of the doubt, to believe his story. Why? Because we have decades of relationship capital. We have a friendship history that I don't have with the person bringing the accusation. But in this instance, my obligation is not to protect him. It's not to be his friend, but to protect and love the flock. This means calling for an independent investigation, and if it comes down to it, doing everything in my power to remove him from his position of power. And he would do the same for me. I told the elder candidates, this is how seriously we have to approach abuse. We cannot look out for our own. We cannot ignore, cover up, blame the victim, or deny. We cannot be like Abram. He didn't care about the victim. She didn't matter to him. He didn't see her. He didn't hear her. But you know what? God did. God did. Did you know that Hagar's name, it means stranger? And that's so fitting, because that's how victims feel. They feel like they're all alone. No one believes them. No one would understand. No one sees. My heart breaks for Hagar, to be taken from her country, Egypt, forced to serve someone like Sarai, to endure years and years of emotional, psychological, physical, sexual abuse, and to have no one speak for her, to have no one care about her. Even the baby that she was about to bear, it wouldn't be hers. It would legally belong to Sarai and Abram. She had nobody. Nobody saw her. And she flees into the wilderness, a pregnant woman with nothing, no chance of survival. And it's there, at her lowest moment, that the angel of the Lord comes to her. It says, angel of the Lord, but this is no messenger sent by God. This angel speaks for God and as God. The angel of the Lord is God himself. It's a theophany, a visible and physical appearance of the divine. Who is the visible of the invisible God? This is the pre-incarnate Jesus who comes to Hagar. He doesn't send someone else. He doesn't speak from a cloud. He seeks her out, finds her, and promises to bless her. But he says something a bit off here. Verse 8 says, "And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit to her.'" It seems like Jesus is telling her to go back to her abuser and continue to endure abuse. Why would he do that? I would be an awful counselor and pastor if I told one of you to remain in an abusive environment. I would never tell a wife who is being abused to go back and submit to her abusive husband. Why is Jesus saying this? Well, there's something you need to understand about Genesis. It was written to the Israelites who were in the wilderness after they had escaped Egypt. Again and again, a theme in Genesis is that the promised land is Canaan. In Genesis 12, God calls Abram to leave his home and go to the land which he promised him. But instead, what does Abram do? He winds up in Egypt, and he has to be brought out of there. Going back to Egypt, it represents departing from the redemptive plan of God. That's where Hagar is headed. Back to her home, back to her people. But God is telling her that she is to play an important role in his plan of redemption, which is not in Egypt, but will happen through Abram. I have something much bigger for you and your child than you being back in Egypt, living comfortably with your people. What this tells us ultimately is that Hagar's greatest need is not deliverance and protection from abuse. It's God's redemption. What she needs most is not safety, but Jesus. And this doesn't mean that God excuses what's being done to her. God hates abuse. And I would never say to someone, just endure it because God has a plan for you. But the point here is this: you are never better off apart from God. One of the big trends right now on social media is the ex-evangelical movement. Many people, even former pastors and religious leaders, are deconstructing and departing from the faith. And many of them are doing it loudly and publicly. Most of them have been hurt by the church. They're sick of the hypocrisy of Christians. They're just done with it all. And maybe that's you this morning. You've been hurt by the church or other Christians. You see all these pastors and leaders falling through scandal and abuse. You see Christians who aren't living the way that they should be living double lives. And you're thinking, maybe this is all worthless. And you're in the wilderness, thinking of how much better life would be in Egypt if you weren't a Christian at all. If that is you, can I echo what Jesus says to Hagar? Don't go to Egypt. Don't leave the faith. Don't leave Jesus. He has something much better for you in his redemptive plan, even if you can't see it right now. You will not find what you are looking for in Egypt apart from him. Please stay and trust that he will protect and bless you and reveal his greater purposes. Hagar's response to Jesus is in verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Hagar is the very first person in the Bible to ever name God. Hagar, whose name means stranger, is not a stranger to Jesus. She's known, she's seen, she's loved. Her cries of anguish did not fall on deaf ears. Jesus tells her that the child in her womb would be called Ishmael. Ishmael means God listens. Jesus, he doesn't just see Hagar. He doesn't just know her or hear her, but he also knows her pain. Jesus goes to the cross where he becomes Hagar, a stranger to all, even to his beloved Father. Yet with his dying words, Jesus prays for the very people who are abusing and murdering him. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. I want to close the sermon by speaking to these three groups of people. First, to those who perpetrate abuse. To those like Sarai, I want to say, God hates violence and abuse. There's no justification for it ever. No one deserves to be treated unjustly. No one. Abuse, it violates God's design. It's never okay, and God will one day call on you to answer for the ways in which you have hurt those whom he loves. But I also want to say that Jesus cancels nobody. There is grace and redemption for you. Jesus prayed on the cross for the Father to forgive you. Repent of your sin. Stop your patterns of abuse. Find healing and restoration for your soul in the gospel. But can I add this? If you are abusing someone, then that person needs to find healing and restoration apart from you. Let them find it. You're not going to be the one to fix it. Whether it's a spouse, a child, a subordinate, boyfriend, girlfriend, anyone else that you have power over, the best thing you can do is confess, get help, and let the person or people you hurt get help that's not you. You're in no position to fix anyone right now. To the Abrams out there, those of us who have been blind to abuse or have refused to speak against it, hear the call of God to justice. God calls us to see the broken and the vulnerable among us. God is a God who sees. Jesus says in John 10, I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Do you know the sheep? Do you also see the hurting, the abused, the vulnerable who no one else sees, no one else cares about? Will you hear the anguished cries of the oppressed? Will you speak for those who cannot speak? There's a story I love from Luke 7. Jesus is at a fancy dinner with religious leaders at Simon the Pharisee's house. And during the meal, a woman who was most likely a prostitute comes in weeping. And she pours expensive perfume on Jesus' feet. She wipes it with her hair. And this is a huge scandal. My favorite part of the story is verse 44, where Jesus turns to the woman and he asks Simon a question. Simon, do you see this woman? Do you see her? Like really see her? Beloved daughter of God. Not her sin. Not her reputation. Not her shame, not her faults. Do you see her like I see her? You are a God who sees. May we also see the way that he sees. And finally, to the Hagars, to those who have been hurt, I want to say to you loudly and clearly, abuse is not your fault. It's never your fault. You didn't ask for it. You didn't deserve it. No one deserves it. No one deserves to be treated unjustly. God sees your suffering. God wants to rescue you. See this Jesus who sees you. Let Jesus lift up your head. See yourself the way that he sees you. And speak. Speak to Jesus. Give him your burdens. And when you're ready, will you speak to those who might help you? Those who might understand and help you be healed and restored. Speak to those who will stand with you against injustice and abuse. You are not a stranger. You are not alone. You are seen and you are loved. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Let's pray together.